There's some strange, deep-seated irresistibility to the notion of a monster. Dripping fangs, gnarled claws, eyes that slice through the thickest of darkness. They're like us, but off, ready to mangle. They terrify us to no end, but something about them still beckons to something rooted deep inside our psyches, and more importantly, our bodies. Theorists like Carol Clover and Jack Halberstam have long read slasher flicks and monster movies as embodied manifestations of queer gender and sexuality in books like Men, Women, and Chainsaws and Skin Shows, working to create a new realm of scholarship around the fundamental links between horror and queerness. But examining specifically monster-centric horror through the lens of queer theory, it's clear that there's a direct link between the monstrous forms we conceive of for our screens and the ideas of transgenderness, non-binariness, and any other terms we use to describe the tension between how we are assigned to present and the ways we adapt, modify, and queer our bodies in opposition to that assignment. Monsters are free to gender themselves however they'd like. They are under no social obligation to conform to the binary that so wildly limits our own ability to conceptualize and relate to our own bodies. Thus, they're free to court the type of embodied gender catharsis that can only be achieved through transformation, obliteration, decoration, and how devilishly fun those things can be when you're free to be a monster. To begin, let's define a few key terms. Most importantly, and perhaps most complex, is the term queer. For our purposes, queer is used to denote any gender identity other than cisgender and any sexuality other than heterosexual. It's a term with a long, complicated history. Once used exclusively as a slur against lesbian and gay people, it has since been reclaimed as an identity in and of itself, and an umbrella term used by folks who either don't want to use or don't feel represented by any of the more rigidly denoted labels of identification. Merriam-Webster defines the term monster as an animal of strange or terrifying shape, a threatening force, and appropriately, one who deviates from normal or acceptable behavior or character. George Haggerty writes, "The Gothic novel is a liberating phenomenon, which expands the range of possibilities for novelistic expression. Thus, it was clear from early in the reign of Gothic horror that it was ripe with possibilities for expanding and redefining not just how we create art, but how we use art to conceptualize ourselves and our bodies and our relationships with each other. But what makes a Gothic figure, and more specifically a Gothic monster? Historically, the term Gothic has undergone a lot of cultural metamorphosis. It's a realm of imagination rooted in subversion, rebellion, and the return of the repressed, to borrow a phrase from Valdine Clemens. As the genre developed, Gothic came to connote more than just a setting. It was a thematically consistent set of motifs, emotions, and imagery, all rooted in the inescapable fear of our own souls and the allure of setting free the deepest, most hidden, most monstrous corners of them. In that sense, they're fundamentally rooted in notions of queerness and subversion, and they quite literally were. Frankenstein, written by a bisexual woman, follows two men who together give birth to a hypermasculine being of ambiguous sexuality. Dracula, written by an alleged closeted gay man, there is some debate to Stoker's sexuality, presents a polysexual figure whose gender performance is ambiguous and deeply fluid, and for whom physical penetration isn't tied at all to gender or sexuality. Fast forward to 1930s and 40s America, an era marked by the internal self-censorship of Hollywood via a series of guidelines known as the Hays Code. Imposed and enforced by the motion picture producers and distributors of America, the code placed severe restrictions on depictions of violence, crime, religion, and other content with potential moral ambiguity on film. During the peak of the code's reign of terror, Universal Pictures produced a string of genre-defining canonical horror films, many of which were adaptations of 19th century Gothic horror novels like Frankenstein and Dracula. Of course, the themes and content outlined by the Hays Code weren't going to simply vanish from Hollywood altogether. Thus, the question became, how can those ideas be encoded in such a way that they pass over the heads of the censors, but can still be decoded by those to whom the works are directly speaking? It was the perfect time to reintroduce and reinterpret these stories in particular, subversive, coded expressions of explicitly queer realities. And many of these films were also helmed by queer directors, like James Whale, who was responsible for Frankenstein, its sequel Bride of Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man, all of which have explicitly queer subtext.
Welcome to my home. Enter freely of your own will and leave some of the happiness you bring.
Dracula has been adapted to film countless times by countless different artists, though among the most fascinating interpretations of Stoker's Count is F.W. Murnau's 1922 classic unauthorized adaptation, Nosferatu.
Nosferatu is the one that changed everything.
Where do horror movies really start? They start with Nosferatu. They start with this coded, phallic, vampire cinematic image. That's where our understanding of what a monster is begins, and it's no wonder that the monster is so captivating and so seductive, even as they're horrifying.
Despite the numerous interpretations of the character, there's one key element to Count Dracula's ethos that has remained confidently intact across adaptations, which is that he serves as an embodied manifestation of gender anxiety in Victorian England. The Count and his harem of brides, and Transylvania more broadly, can be read as a distinct realm of sexual liberation into which Renfield, Jonathan Harker, and Van Helsing venture, first, notably, on matters of capital and property, and later to resolve fears of corruption, deviance, and their impending spread beyond the boundaries of Transylvania. And spaces of sexual liberation are inherently synonymous with queerness. To be truly sexually liberated requires a refutation of the gender binary, and once you define yourself as an opposition to the binary, the notion of heterosexuality becomes meaningless. Thus, if Transylvania is a sexually liberated space, it is by definition a queer space. And it's called Transylvania. Transylvania. Come on. And in order for normal sexuality to be deemed normal, it must be placed in opposition to abnormal sexuality. Thus, for these supposedly straight, cisgender Victorian-era men, Transylvania represents the deviance against which they can argue their cool, sexy, fundamentalist straightness. In his 1992 Dracula adaptation, Francis Ford Coppola and screenwriter James V. Hart place that fundamental queerness at center stage. Dracula himself undergoes several drastic physical metamorphoses as the plot progresses, and his sense of dominance is strengthened or threatened, and his desires, sexual and otherwise, are conquered or denied. Gary Oldman waltzes across the screen in lavish crimson robes, transforming from matronly count to greasy withering goblin to genuine bat-winged gargoyle, both penetrating and being penetrated. No! Dracula's physical form has become a manifestation of gender ambiguity, writes Christopher McGonagall, specifically of Coppola's interpretation of the character. He can no longer maintain a distinct gender identity, instead creating his own amorphous and foggy figure. It's that fog, ironically, that brings the queer monster into sharp focus. Dracula, in all his incarnations, embraces the inherent shapelessness and liberation, as well as the feelings of fear and monstrosity that characterize living as a gradient within a grid, and the quest to alter your body to reflect that tension. It's a thematic through-line that binds together much of classic Gothic horror, a realm that imagines our bodies as malleable, unfinished, and, on occasion, completely invisible. In 1933, director James Whale found his way back onto the Universal lot, set to helm an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel The Invisible Man. The script had initially been conceived as a follow-up to Dracula, though the studio ultimately opted to hold off on the project and produce Frankenstein first. But 2 years later, the project was brought to horrifying life by Whale and his frequent screenwriting partner, R.C. Sheriff. It follows Jack Griffin, a scientist working under the guidance of Dr. Cranley, in the aftermath of a self-inflicted experiment that leaves Griffin completely invisible. The story opens with Griffin stumbling into an English village in search of a place to stay and develop an antidote to his affliction in secret. But as the story progresses, he ultimately becomes drunk on the power his invisibility grants him and begins gleefully terrorizing the village's residents. Through his invisibility, Griffin transcends the need for a physical body. Instead, he exists as a sort of embodied performance of non-binary gender expression. The body he was born with is irrelevant, and the only thing the villagers can see is how he chooses to dress and style and gender it. Body decoration and modification has long been a central facet of queer culture. The first body piercing shop in the United States was opened by a gay man who had learned the practice through the BDSM and leather community. At a time when gay sex was criminalized and gender nonconformity pathologized, queer people were asserting their right to bodily autonomy, writes Zelda Weinstock, to do what they wanted to and with their bodies without shame or persecution. The film is set in the real-world village of Iping, which is also a Christian parish. Thus, the introduction of a fundamentally queered body into such a space and the violent reactions of the villagers to a person for whom bodily decoration is empowering reflects long-standing religious attitudes regarding the tension between the religious sanctity of the human body and the realities of queerness. God made your body in his image, and to modify it is to defile it and to defy him. And Griffin's death at the end of the film serves as a potent reminder of how being openly queer, especially at the time of both the original novel's publication and the film's production, was fatal for many. a reality ultimately reflected in the life of James Whale himself, whose life ended by suicide at the age of 68. What happens when our body's limitations become unbearable, and it begins to feel like the only thing we can do to make ourselves feel at peace is to start ourselves from scratch? We destroy and recreate until we can embody our own ideal performance of self, an act for which the story of Dr. Frankenstein and his monster serves as the perfect Gothic allegory. George Haggerty argues that the most fundamental common element of Gothic writing is the transgression of sexual and social relationships. And what more effective method of transgression than to bring about from the dead a creature of indeterminable sexuality who is flatly and violently socially rejected by nearly all who encounter it? Like the monster, I am too often perceived as less than fully human due to the means of my embodiment, writes transgender activist Susan Stryker. Like the monsters as well, my exclusion from human community fuels a deep and abiding rage in me that I, like the monster, direct against the conditions in which I must struggle to exist. At the core of Stryker's argument lies the understanding that a creature, connotatively and etymologically, is defined simply by the fact that it has been created. She also draws a distinct parallel between the medically modified unnaturalness of the transsexual body and Frankenstein's monster, whose flesh was obliterated and sewn together in a shape other than that from which it originated. The reason the presence of the monster excites such a violent fury in the villagers who seek to destroy him is that the obliteration of the body represents a fundamental destabilization of fixed genders. Binaries are so central to the way we categorize ourselves and our relationships with both each other and with our world. And the entire point of queerness is to challenge that system and prefigure a world in which fundamentalism is rejected to make room for fluidity, amorphousness, and abnormality, and to make obsolete the language of classification upon which we've built our social order. Thus, Frankenstein's monster is all too fitting an allegory for transgenderness and transsexuality. Dr. Frankenstein's success in granting himself authorship over life only proves that such an endeavor is pointless. It only spurs recognition in Frankenstein of the monster as a dark mirror of his own image, a mirror who finds power in a monstrous identity and uses that power to reject the narrow vision of its creator, almost as though the monster and Dr. Frankenstein are two halves of a whole, the former of which is the true queered self, and the latter an embodiment of the internalized fears of disrupting the way one is shaped to view the limits of their own body. I want to lay claim to the dark power of my monstrous identity without using it as a weapon against others or being wounded by it myself, writes Stryker. And of those who would play the role of the Mad Doctor, she says, I do not fall from the grace of their company. I roar gleefully away from it like a Harley straddling, dildo-packing leather dyke from hell. This queerness isn't something that needs to be excavated or extrapolated from Gothic horror. It's baked into the text. It's the ink into which Stoker, Wells, and Shelley dipped their pens to immortalize these monstrous bodies into the culture. It's burned into the celluloid of Browning, Coppola, and Whale. There would be no such beast as a monster were it not for our deep-rooted need to defile, obliterate, rebuild, modify, decorate, and adapt our bodies. It's a beast born of our own dissatisfaction, of a recognition of agency over our own bodies, as a fantasy of absolute transformation. There would be no monsters without queerness.